You're listening to this podcast, and so are a lot of other people in Southern Oklahoma. Ardmore Leader is about one thing: local. Local news, local events, and local business. So don't just buy another ad. Invest in your business. 319-9688 or visit ardmoreleader.com. Work with Ardmore Leader today, and let's find new ways to tell your story to a local audience.
Thanks for checking out The Junction. This is a podcast where we try to make connections between Ardmorites. I'm Ardmore Leader News Director Michael Dean Smith, and joining us this week is Dr. Alaina Roberts. She teaches history at the University of Pittsburgh, but she's actually going to be coming to town next month on June 30th to talk about her research into freed black people just after the Civil War back in the 1860s. Her book is called I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land. That book explores the details of her research, and she's joining us in The Junction by phone from Pittsburgh to talk about it all. So, Dr. Roberts, thanks for joining us this week.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I figured this would be a good conversation to start off by actually recognizing who occupied this land here in southern Oklahoma before the settlement you talk about in your book, because this hasn't always been Ardmore, this hasn't always been Oklahoma, and this hasn't always been Chickasaw Nation either. So do you know who the people that were here in this part of Oklahoma before the westward expansion on this continent that you talk about in your book?
Well, there are so many different groups that claim that space at different times, like the, Chickasaw, Apache, Osage, the Kansas people, the Chickasaw people. It's a space kind of that has been, well-traveled, I guess you could say, like well-settled, well-hunted on for many years.
Mm-hmm. So I've been reading your book, and I'm probably about a third of the way through it now, but I do want to briefly talk about something that I have noticed as I've been reading for the past few days. I feel like there has been a whitewashing of history and a whitewashing of Reconstruction in particular, and in that, I feel like it's really downplayed the politics of certain Native populations, Black populations, and while reading your book, reading about the history both during and after the Civil War, the politics of it is just a lot more complex than I ever really knew. And that kind of goes for the complex politics of the five tribes, both within the five tribes and outside of the five tribes. Is that kind of a fair assessment? Is that a fair example of a whitewashing of history?
Oh, totally. There's so much history that we don't learn because from the time we're in kindergarten, we're learning a very fixed narrative, and it's very positive. It's very celebratory. But I think in order to be able to really celebrate something like the United States, you also have to understand that there were, not so great chapters, and that there are a lot of different diverse and multicultural people who have shaped the country.
In reading it, I noticed the book had mentioned various treaties that the U.S. government had signed with various groups, especially the five tribes. Do you feel that some of the whitewashing of it kind of downplayed some of those treaties that were signed and a lot of times broken by the government as well?
Definitely. There are almost no treaties that haven't been broken in some form or another, unfortunately. And the reason that the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Creeks, the Seminoles, all the Indian nations that we know of, for the most part in Oklahoma right now are here is because of broken treaties, right? Mm-hmm. They had agreements between the United States before many states even existed, that recognized that they had land in the southeast or the northeast, and still the U.S. ignored those treaties and then tried to force them to live elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. And I something too that I've noticed growing up. I grew up in the South, and there were a lot of things I didn't know about slavery, especially the Native tribes and their use of slavery through the 19th century. Was that something that has been common knowledge, or is that also part of kind of the whitewashing of history of not really explaining how deep slavery went in so many corners of society?
It definitely has not been common knowledge. I mean, it was part of my own family history, and I still didn't know it until I was in college and I started talking to people, actually, some of my relatives in Oklahoma who were a little closer to this history that I found out. And I wondered, like, why did I never learn this? And I still hear that over and over again when I give talks around the country, that people wonder, why have I not heard about this?
Mm. As you were doing research for this book and just for your education in general, where did, like, as far as traveling, where did some of this research take you? I know you had some kind of very personal sources for this research, but what kind of places, what kind of people did you get to learn about and talk to as you were researching some of this?
Well, those sources close to me were some of my family members. So one of my second cousins, Travis Roberts, lived in Ardmore his whole life. He had a lot of the stories passed down from his mother and grandmother. And so I got to kind of learn from him. He would take me around Ardmore and show me places that our family had lived on their kind of original allotments from the late 1800s, which was amazing that it's still in our family. I also got to talk to a lot of Chickasaw and Choctaw citizens who shared some of their history with me, and that made me really want to understand, where each of us were coming from, because this is a story about, exploitation. It's about some kind of negative things, but it also gave me a positive experience of being able to talk to people from many different backgrounds and learn to kind of weave the story together.
How else is this chapter of history being told? Because you said that the use of slavery by a lot of Native groups and Native tribes wasn't really common knowledge, even with it being such a direct part of your history. Even you didn't know about it. What other ways is this chapter of U.S. history being told that you've noticed?
There have been a few museum exhibits. So the National Museum of the American Indian in D.C. had a traveling exhibit for a while that included some of this history, as well as a broader history of people who are mixed race, Black and Native American. And then the Cherokee Nation had an amazing exhibit about a year ago about their history with slavery that was really kind of taking responsibility for owning slaves, but also looking toward the future, what it means to have Black people as part of their nation. But when I think about, what I would love to see, I would love to see the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations, for example, and their new amazing cultural centers talking about this history, and they don't really.
I know. So you want to see these kind of conversations keep going to get more people aware about some of this. How have people been responding to your research in particular and to your book in particular since you've published it back in 21?
Well, I've talked to a lot of people. Like, a lot of people have reached out to me, emailed me, listened to talks I've given on Zoom and commented there. People who are tribal citizens, people who are white, people who are Black, really kind of responding to not knowing this story, but then also about what it means today, because tribal nations are so important to Oklahoma's culture and their economy. They have a lot of power. And so sometimes I think they're a little wary of talking about this history because they think it makes them look bad. But really, there are many things in our history that are complicated and negative, but I think it makes us stronger, as the current chief of the Cherokee Nation always says. It makes us a stronger nation to acknowledge our past and to work toward a better future, I think, than to try to pretend it didn't exist.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You had mentioned that there were some exhibits at would you say the Choctaw Culture Center? I don't want to.
Oh, the Cherokee Nation.
Cherokee Nation. Like how much do they explore that part of their history, or really just our history, since this is America? What were some of the ways that they were exploring that and kind of owning that history?
Well, for any of your listeners who are kind of aware of what goes on with people who are called freedmen, who are descendants of people enslaved in these 5 tribes in Oklahoma, the Cherokee Nation had that history where they had enslaved people, and then those people were citizens for generations of the Cherokee Nation, and then they disenfranchised them. So they threw out those people's citizenship. And so for decades after that, Cherokee freedmen were fighting legally to be let back into the tribe, as the treaty detailed back in 1866. And so finally they were successful. Finally, the Cherokee Nation decided, okay, we're going to accept these people back in 2017. And so the exhibit that came out, I think maybe 2 years ago, was really about that whole struggle. And so it was about first the kind of relationships and history that Black people had in the Cherokee Nation, the role they played in, helping to physically build the nation, in, making money for prominent members, people like John Ross, people like Sequoyah, and then how they were disenfranchised, and then how they were, made citizens again. And so it's about really this whole cycle, and trying to do better going forward, acknowledging that whole history.
I want to talk a little bit kind of a personal question for you too. We're speaking with Dr. Alaina Roberts. She's a history professor at the University of Pittsburgh. She's also the author of the book "I've Been Here All the While: Black Freedom on Native Land." It's a very interesting book for anybody that likes maybe some of the likes to learn about some of the more painful parts of our history. But early on in the book, actually, I think it's in the introduction, you mention Ardmore in particular and kind of a tie that you have to Ardmore. Can you talk briefly about that and kind of what your relationship is with the city of Ardmore and with the state of Oklahoma beyond that connection?
Yeah, so my grandfather was born in Ardmore. My great-grandfather and my great-grandmother were born in Ardmore. So it's always been, to me, kind of this space of our family's history. I used to go there as a child to family reunions, but I never really understood the place that it had in my family's history until I understood the broader picture of Native American slaveholding, because obviously the Chickasaws and the Choctaws, the people in those tribes enslaved my ancestors, and they were forced there. And so understanding, they were forced there, and then my family were enslaved by them, like these are two different kinds of oppression. And so they're both facing different kinds of oppression. And so how do we get, people in this time and period and doing this to each other, really? Like, why didn't they work together? Why didn't they both say we're both suffering from, Europeans and Americans coming in and enslaving us or taking our land? Like, unfortunately, that's not what happened. People didn't kind of say, let's just work together and have a positive relationship.
And I'm kind of straying away from my notes now because I was thinking about something that I was reading last night, I believe, in your book. As I was reading about the slave trade before the Civil War, that, obviously you had a lot of white plantation owners in the Deep South participating in the slave trade. But then you also had some of these more wealthy Native groups and Native American tribes participating in the slave trade. Do you know if there was any sort of cross commerce? I hate using that word when we're talking about people, but were these Indian nations and the white groups, were they trading back and forth, or were they kind of isolated industries?
They're definitely interconnected. So, for example, Chickasaws, who are the nation that I studied the closest, they were originally slave raiders and catchers. So they would go out on missions to enslave Native people, first of all. So in the 1600s, it started with enslaving other Native people. Then when it moved into African slaveholding, then they would, catch Black people who had run away from the Georgia colony or the Carolina colony. And sometimes they would then begin to own those people, or sometimes they would sell them back to their white owners. And then they transitioned into owning Black slaves themselves. And so it's a transition after coming into contact with Europeans and learning, okay, this is a way to make money. Okay, this is a way that we can be seen as civilized and kind of better and smarter. And so then that becomes part of the livelihoods of some of the more influential and wealthy Native people in these nations.
And something else that took me aback as I was reading it was when removal really started happening, and a lot of these groups were being forced from Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, forced west into the Indian Territory and what's now Oklahoma. You had written that there were some who saw slave ownership not as a way to help with their fields or the actual work involved, but they actually saw it more of as an investment, that this purchase can actually walk itself to this new territory. Kind of what was your reaction as you started learning about that aspect of slave ownership, not as work, but as an investment?
Studying slavery it's not fun. Like it's very, like the sources that are really putting, people of African descent into property, essentially. Like, you see their values, you see how often usually they're not named at all. And I was used to that with reading about, of course, white Europeans and Americans, but learning about the Chickasaw Nation or the Choctaw, Creek, Seminole nations, and seeing that they were treating these people in the same way. It was very kind of hard to take and understand. And so, yes, what you're talking about is, instead of bringing all of their fancy plateware or their clothing, et cetera, their furniture, they could sell that to the people moving into Mississippi, and then they could buy enslaved people, and then those people, yes, could walk themselves across, right? And usually they're not on horses. The owner might be on a horse themselves, but enslaved people are walking, and they are the ones kind of experiencing this alongside Native people. And so when I think about what I want Native Americans really to take from my book and from this talk I'm doing on June 30th is that Black and Native people experience some of the worst trauma together.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, you're going to be coming to Ardmore on June 30th, 5:30 p.m. at the Ardmore Public Library to talk about this. What kind of conversations do you hope can get sparked as people start learning about this rather ugly portion of American history?
I want to talk to people who, are interested in making a difference today, or who are interested in kind of encouraging Native nations to, take responsibility, but also to have productive conversations. Like, let's stop trying to shut out this discussion because there are articles written about this all the time. The New York Times covers the Cherokee cases or the Creek case right now. People know about this history, or are starting to know. And so, what is the danger in acknowledging this past and saying, we can be better than our ancestors. We can talk about this, and we can incorporate Black people into our nations again.
Well, we've been speaking with Dr. Alaina Roberts. She's a history professor at the University of Pittsburgh. She also authored the book, I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land. She's going to be joined by Reverend Robert Smith next month. He's a history professor at the University of North Texas. They'll be at the Ardmore Public Library on Monday, June 30th at 5:30 p.m. for that discussion on Chickasaw history. The library does have a copy of her book, I've Been Here All the While. Well, as soon as I turn it back in, they'll at least have that one copy. But Dr. Roberts, thank you so much for talking to us about this. Again, it's an awkward conversation to have, but I do agree with you that it's one that needs to be had. So I thank you so much for joining us on The Junction this week to talk about it.
Thank you.